I just hope it turns out I have things I care about, like for real.
You pretended to care about me pretty well.
You're easy to pretend to care about.
Thank you. As are you. At least you'll have a chance at living.
Yeah, but I want to live with you. Yeah, but I want to live with you. I want to live with you.
Hello to all you amazing innies and outies out there, and welcome to my deep dive breakdown and review of Severance Season 2, Episode 10, the finale, titled Cold Harbor. Can love overcome the severance chip? A question that is put to the test in this finale, where we officially get to answer to what Mark's been refining for the past 2 years. We also find out at least one of the main purposes of the GOATs, as we're also introduced to a whole new department, and we see what exactly Cold Harbor is as we watch Mark S choose between Heliar and Gemma. With all that said, get your marching bands ready and your tissues out, because this was an episode filled with shocking reveals, violence, and emotions, and has a cliffhanger that will definitely leave a lot of people wondering what's going to happen next. It is time for us to finally discuss this almost feature-length finale for Severance Season 2. Spoilers ahead. We pick up immediately where things ended after the final moments of episode 9, as Cobell questions if any Mark has completed Cold Harbor. Now Mark S is still unaware where he is, as Devin explains, and Cobell repeats the question, but with a more aggression behind it, as any Mark lets her know that the file hasn't been completed yet, which means Miss Casey, or as Devin corrects her, Gemma, is still alive. Now it's important to remember Mark S, even with the flashes that he witnessed in episode 7 with Gemma's flashback scenes, he only knows Miss Casey and has no personal experience or connection with Gemma. Now Cobell begins going over where Gemma can be found, but any Mark interrupts her because he's already aware of the export halls that leads to the elevator, because as we remember from Irv's map, that was mentioned to him back in episode 6 when Dylan told Mark and Helly in the kitchen. Now a little detail here, but notice the look on Cobell's face when Mark tells her that they already knew where they can find the elevator. To me, this moment debunks the online rumor that Cobell was the person that Irv was talking to on the payphone throughout the season, because if he was talking to her, that information wouldn't have been a surprise to Cobell. Again, my best guess was he was leaving voicemails to PD, but looks like we'll have to put this on the list of things to discover in Season 3. Now back in the MDR department with Helly and James, we see he confirms my theory about him telling her, "You tricked me," being reference to her actions at the gala, as he tells her what a funny speech she gave at that party. Now we see Helly grabbing her pen for her safety, just in case this weird guy pulls something crazy, as he admits to being upset that night after her speech, and he even threw tins of candy in frustration.
God, you're fucking weird.
As he slowly walks closer to Helly, he tells her that he doesn't even love his own daughter, Helena, again confirming something I believe we all agreed was the case based on all the interactions between father and daughter throughout the season. He tells Helly how he used to see Kier and Helena, but Kier left her as she grew up. Now Helly sarcastically calls him a great dad after that moment, but here we get another confirmation from last episode's reveal at the birthing cabins about the line that said one of James.
I had others in the shadows, but he wasn't in them either.
This confirms that there are other Egan children out there in the world, as he tried seeing if he saw Kier in them, but he didn't. Now the questions that come to mind after this moment, are they still alive? Or did he get rid of them after not seeing Kier in them and didn't want them spreading around that he's their father? I wonder if this is a detail that was going to be addressed further next season. For example, if they are still alive, are those children now permanent, never to leave workers of Lumen that PD spoke of in season 1 and was seen on his map? Could some of his children possibly be characters that we already know? For example, Milchick or Drummond or even Cobell. What about Mark S. or Devin or even Rickon and his weird ass friends? I think about him maybe even impregnating the Lumen employees, which explains the scene from season 1 of episode 3. Remember the news segment that had a story about an innie that became pregnant without their knowledge? And we saw Natalie was being interviewed about that situation. Again, I hope this is something that is further explored in an inevitable season 3. Now James tells Helly that it wasn't until that night of the gala that he saw Kiergan in her, as Helly rushes up to him and tells him that his family created hell and he's gonna burn in it while holding back the pen that she's ready to use on him if need be. Now James isn't concerned, but instead he looks at her and tells her, there he is, referring to seeing Kier. Now before walking away, he tells Helly that tomorrow will be a special day, as she yells at him wanting to know what he wants from her. It was interesting to me that he compared Helly's rebellious nature and feistiness to Kier, because the way they talked about him in the show, I would have never guessed that they shared similar traits. Going back to the fourth appendix story about Dieter Egan in episode 4, I feel like my thoughts about the story being about Kier having an innie and an outie, and thinking about Dieter being his more aggressive side, and how Helly is kind of like that side of him and being the opposite of his innie, which is similar to how we see Helena versus Helly. Now later in this episode, we get a glimpse at seeing a more different side of Jaime as well. Now back at the cabin, Innie Mark learns from Cobell about Cold Harbor and how Gemma will be killed after its completion, as she lays out the plan for him to get down to the testing floor, where it will require both Mark's innie and outie for this heist rescue mission. Now here we get another little reveal as we find out that the chips are only attuned to the innie's designated floor. Now outie Mark will be responsible for finding Gemma on the testing room floor, while innie Mark will be the one to guide her to the stairwell to exit. Now of course innie Mark is overwhelmed by this Tom Cruise mission that seems impossible, as Devin takes notice of this and tells him how important this is, because if they can prove that Lumen kidnapped Gemma, then they can destroy Lumen and shut them down forever. Now, for Devin to say that Gemma was kidnapped, I'm to assume that information was given to her by Cobell, which we didn't see obviously, but if true, this confirms that Gemma wasn't a willing participant in the experiments to begin with.
Well, if Lumen ends, then what happens to every innie on the severed floor?
This conversation and what happens after Innie Mark brings this up, to me, is the backbone of this episode and really puts an emphasis on the overall story about how love and what life means to both the innies and the outies. Now, Cobell assures him that by doing this, it doesn't mean that he'll be ending his life, but we see Innie Mark isn't convinced, as Devin gives him a camcorder to watch what his outie has to say about this whole situation. Let me tell y'all something, I was so compelled and just on the edge of my seat by this entire conversation that's about to happen between the two Marks, and during this very complex conversation, I completely understood where both sides' points of views were coming from, as Innie Mark watches the first of many responses from his outie. Notice how initially it started with Innie Mark being surprised and taken back in a positive way to finally seeing his outie for the very first time. As we see, outie Mark's first video came off very sincere and honest, and even apologizes for creating Innie Mark as a means to escape his pain after thinking he lost Gemma.
Because I took their word for it, you've been living a nightmare for 2 years. It's horrific what they've done to you. And part of the reason I'm here is to make it right.
As he presses play and makes his first of many responses, but his first reaction, like his outies, comes from a place of curiosity and concern, and not defiant or from a place of anger, which we'll later see. I love the use of seeing the switch between them as outie Mark watches the video outside. Look, I'm a simple dude. Seeing the literal innie talking inside while the outie watched and responds outside was just so clever to me. As outie Mark watches his innie in surprise is seeing him for the very first time, and they both can see the differences between each other from the way they speak and how they actually act is just completely different from one another. Innie Mark tells outie Mark how he and others view the experience on the severed floor and how they make what they have work.
Because we find ways to make it work, to feel whole, which is why what you're asking scares me. You know, because whatever this life is, it's all we have, and we don't want it to end.
Again, I love that they gave us this scene to explore how one's innie and outie would talk and discuss their perspective of this very particular situation. And honestly, it kind of felt like I was watching a mini movie or a short film within this very intimate and cinematic finale. I won't go over every single detail and response, but again, it started off very understanding and both sides showed empathy for the other, but unfortunately things took a turn and each became very defensive when outie Mark brings up the reintegration program, which we see Innie Mark questions if any of this is even true. But it really got bad when they both mentioned the ones they love, and when the lives of Gemma and Helly are being threatened, it made the conversation more difficult to get back on track. As we watch them go back and forth, you notice how different they are, but also you start to see their more, let's say, negative traits start to emerge. We see Mark's lack of patience and his attitude comes out, as any Mark's lack of life experience and his lack of understanding Gemma's importance to Mark is very much shown in their heated exchange. Now, Outie Mark tries to make his any understand by explaining what he went through in those 2 years thinking that Gemma had died, but again, once he brought up Helene, mispronouncing her name, as we see any Mark did not take a liking to that, and then Outie Mark compared his little bit of time with Helly to Gemma, and from there, the conversation never got back to that once more understanding and open-minded conversation from the start. Any Mark doesn't trust his Outie, as Devin and Cobell are needed, as Cobell wants to speak to any Mark privately. Now, right out the gate, we see Cobell tells any Mark that the numbers he's been refining are indeed associated with Gemma's mind and alters her tempers.
The building blocks of her mind.
Every file that Mark has completed is a new consciousness for Gemma, aka a new any. Now, this reveal is something that we spoke about in my breakdown of episode 7, but now we have concrete confirmation. At this point, any Mark doesn't know who to trust. He can't trust Devin, he can't trust his own any, and Cobell's a whole different story, so I don't blame any Mark when he questions if what he was just told is true. Now, she tries to explain the fact that Helly is Helena and Egan and that he's nothing to them but a means to an end. As any Mark is very upset, and rightfully so. I understand where he's coming from, and we've grown to understanding Annie's experience, but honestly, it reminded me of a kid or an early teen being told the chances of him and his middle school girlfriend likely lasting forever is very unlikely. As we watch him walk out of the cabin, but before doing so, he tells Devin this.
You tell him that the next thing I see, it better be the severed floor, or I swear he will never see his wife again.
Now, before any Mark leaves, Cobell actually suggests that the reintegration process is his only chance, this being the first time that she's actually on the side of it working. Now, we'll discuss more of my disappointment of that plot angle a little bit later. Now, another thing that stood out to me is Cobell yelling her care for the any version of Mark. Now, it was never explained why she cares so much for Mark S, and I'm assuming she was referring to any Mark. I mean, she could have been talking about both of them, but to me, it seemed like she was specifically talking to any Mark. Again, I don't know, is it because she sees a version of her in his any, if there's an idea of love overcoming things, or if it was something else all entirely. Now, this section completes the first act of this episode. Now, a couple things I want to mention before breaking down the second act of this episode. First off, I have to know, whose side were you on during the Marks sharing their side of their story? Were you team any Mark or were you team Outie Mark? Comment your thoughts below. Secondly, the scene between the two Marks going back and forth to me was amazing. I love how the lighting was used in reverse, where Outie Mark's scenes were outside and we saw the use of blue, and we saw any Mark with the fire being next to him and we saw the color red, representing one's any and Outie, but again in reverse. And third, we now know the full responsibilities of what the MDR department does, and they, or should I say particularly Mark S, created each new any for Gemma. Mark S working on her files was essential for Lumen's plans of Severance and testing to see if anything including a deeper connection or love can bypass the Severance process. Mark's Outie's consciousness and his awareness of Gemma never stopped him from working on the files because any Mark had no personal attachment or connections to Gemma. Now, with all that being said, I'm wondering exactly what were Helly, Dylan, Irving, hell, Petey, and any of the MDR employees, what have they been refining this whole time? Were they refining someone else that's similar to Gemma's situation? Or were they refining different varieties of the Severance chip or different models for mass production at some point? Focusing on our MDR department team, were they just doing work that ultimately served no purpose but were placed there as means to keep Mark S happy and to make him feel like he's a part of this family and community? Am I wrong in thinking this? Did I miss something? Will this be another season 3 story to explain further? Comment your thoughts below, not just on this particular question about what the others besides Mark S was doing in MDR, but also your overall thoughts about the first half of this episode, the scene between Helly and James, and also Mark versus Mark. Let me know your thoughts about this first act in the comments below. Now, as we enter into the second half of this episode, where things get really crazy, we see that any Mark's threats actually worked. As we get this incredible transition from him walking out of the cabin door into the severed floor to a very large and very interesting new piece of art. Now, I do want to mention, Audi, Mark, Devin, and Cobell never actually got confirmation from any Mark that he will complete the assignment, so they're on a hope and a prayer that he'll follow through when he returns to work. Now on the 7th floor, for the first time since his sexual encounter with Helly and his nose bleeds, we see Any Mark is greeted by this new painting that I most definitely want on my wall, and I'm going to call this the portrait of Mark S. life. As we see most of the various key characters we've met in the show, with Mark as the centerpiece. Now on the left of him, we'll call this the family and friends side. This includes Mark's Any and Audi family and work family and friends. We have the MDR family, including PD, and you'll even see the replacements of the MDR department made it as well. We see even the MDR department's close ones and friends like Bert and Felicia. We even have Ricken's friends all the way in the back. Now on the right, we have the more Lumen upper management side. We have Milchick, Natalie, Miss Wong, Griner, Cobell, and the GOAT department and the Four Tempers in the back as well. Up top, we have the previous CEO Egan's with Helena in the middle. Now, shout out to the incredible artist who made this painting. And again, seriously, Apple, if you're listening, please send this wonderful piece of art to my house. Now, as Helly arrives, pay attention to the colors both characters are wearing in this moment, which is green and blue, important for later as we see them hug after not seeing each other for a few days, as they both have news to share with one another. As they make their way to the department, they're slowly guided by the lights, leading the way in a very dark and ominous manner. As they arrive to the MDR department, they find this over 6-foot statue of Keir Egan holding an envelope with Mark S. name on it.
Mark, the founder, wished to witness the historic completion of your 25th file. Helly R. shall also bear witness. From our chair, these splendors await upon your victory. Love, Mr. Milchick.
As they sit at their desks, they play catch up. Meanwhile, we see Milchick welcoming back Dylan G, who's upset to learn that his Audi said no to his resignation. Now, during all this, we see Gemma preparing for her day of victory of Cold Harbor as she sees her outfit, and it's the last one she wore before being taken by Lumen, and they cruelly are putting in her mind that she's finally going to get a chance to go home. Now back in MDR, Helly and Mark talk about the reintegration process and him sharing his thoughts on not completing the file. Now Helly sides with Devin on taking down Lumen and encourages Mark on getting a chance to continue to live if his Audi is telling the truth about sharing their life as one.
Yeah, but I want to live with you.
I'm going to be honest, that line definitely got a tear out of me because, again, I want each of these characters involved to be happy. I want Audi, Mark, and Gemma to be happy and be back together. I want Any, Mark, and Helly to be happy and together. And the way Any, Mark started to tear up, and we saw Helly doing that as well, it definitely got me in my feelings. Now, Helly reminds Mark who her Audi is, and of course, she's an Egan, and that seemed to be the motivation he needed as he begins working on completing the file. As he gets closer and closer to 100%, we see the doctor and Drummond watch in anticipation. Now back with Dylan, he's in the break room as he's given his Audi's response by Milchick, who can't be at two places at once since he let go Miss Wong, as he rushes off to his big performance, leaving Dylan to read it alone. Now here we get our somewhat second conversation between one's Any and Audi, as Audi Dylan starts off the conversation in a pretty aggressive way by telling his Any to go screw himself for kissing his wife.
I get it. She's perfect. When Gretch told me that you're like this self-assured badass, it stung. I hope someday she sees in me what she sees in you.
Now, at the end of the day, Dylan hopes to recapture what Gretchen once saw in him and what she sees in his Any, which to me is incredibly mature of him to say, and even gives Any Dylan the opportunity to leave, but he hopes that he stays. Now, this obviously was more of a one-sided conversation versus the back and forth we saw between the Marks, but I think the biggest moment from this scene was seeing Any Dylan taking his damn glasses off of his face. Now, for you all that do not know, there's been an online connection between fans like myself who find it hilarious whenever we see Dylan's glasses hanging off the tip of his nose at points of the show. And to see what I believe is the very first time he's actually taken off his glasses, this to me has to be one of those where were you moments when it finally happened. But back on a serious note, while there may be more to explore with the love triangle between both Dylans and Gretchen, I personally would be okay if this completed its purpose for Dylan's arc in this particular season. We got to see more of his Audi and his family this season, and we explored his wife being used as leverage by Milchick, and it technically worked for what Seth intended it to be, which was creating a divide within an MDR department. But at the end of the day, I think both Dylan's and Gretchen got perspective and will only learn from this experience. Again, I'm not saying there isn't more to explore with Dylan, but I felt like his arc and the question of what will happen with Gretchen and him maybe not working out was answered in the finale. I guess next season we could see Dylan searching for what happened to Irv, since we didn't see Irv at all in this episode. Now, catching up with Seth, we see him taking off his tie like Superman in a booth as it's almost game time. Now, back with Helly and Mark, they share a nice moment together as she mentions places in the world she's heard of, but without having much context of the geography or the meaning, as she mentions the equator. It's interesting she uses that, because thinking of the equator being what separates the northern and southern hemisphere, and taking how Helly can be used in that metaphor separating Mark and Gemma, and we see them meeting at the metaphorical equator later in this episode. As we see Mark S is 99% complete with Cold Harbor, we see Helly gets Irv's map and she stands behind them, which to me was kind of reminiscing and had me remembering the times that Mark would stand behind her when she was working on her work, as she slides him the map and puts her hand over his hand, and after all this time, Mark S officially completes his 25th file, Cold Harbor. As we see Drummond instructs the doctor to call Mr. Egan, it is time for us to witness our second music dance experience again, and man, it did not disappoint. Look, being born and raised in Chicago, this moment put a damn smile on my face as the Bulls theme music plays and being brought back to the 90s in the show acknowledging Mark, or maybe Kier in this moment as MJ, of the celebration as the lights key on Kier's mannequin and begins to move, and it's clearly being voiced by the doctor as he tells Mark S the following.
You have drawn my grand agendum nearer to fulfillment, thus making you one of the most important people in history.
I love the comedic timing in this moment. It was so perfect as Milchick was 1 second late, most likely due to the fact that he had to run from the break room to this department. But as he arrives, we get the more chippier and happier version of Milchick that we haven't seen in a while. Now, Milchick and Kier have a ridiculous back and forth banter made up of corny jokes and fake audience laughter. But calling back to Mr. Milchick's arc this season, we see he's using his well-versed vocabulary, and Kier calls him out on this, and you can see that this definitely bothered Milchick. But we see Milchick claps back and makes fun of the fact that the statue isn't a true recreation of Kier's actual height, and things definitely get tense after he said that. Now, this to me is where you can hear the doctor's voice come out when he calls Milchick Seth, and it makes me think that Milchick was taking a jab at the doctor because he's a shorter guy. Now, this doesn't stop the incredible celebration from continuing as we meet a brand new department by the name of Choreography and Merriment, C&M, a full-on Lumen marching band that I assume all they do is they spend time at work creating music for occasions just like this, as they play a very upbeat version of the Cure Chosen One song in Mark S' honor, as we see they have a whole performance planned out, and we see Mark S' face and 100% created on large whiteboards. Now, going back to me earlier mentioning the colors that both Helly and Mark are wearing, which are blue and green, now we see that the whole department is now covered in those colors, and we know that Severance uses colors in a very particular way, and normally green is associated with woe or sadness, and blue represents the work life in the Innies world, which to me is foreshadowing to what's to come later from Mark choosing between Gemma and Helly and the sadness that comes from the decision a little bit later. Now, Mark S knows he's on the clock and needs Helly's help in creating a distraction. But before she creates this distraction, no matter how you feel about Milchick's loyalty to Kier and Lumen, there's no denying the man's ability to getting down with the dance moves. As CNN performs a ballad of Ambrose and Gunnell as my boy Seth gets down. Okay, Seth, I see you getting down. Go on ahead with your bad self. Now look, the work is mysterious and very important, but I have to tell you all, I love that the show knew how big and how much the first dance experience in season 1 caught the fans like us attention, and they said to themselves, how could we top this? How much bigger could we get this and make this? And look, while the first one to me was more surprising and came out of left field, but look, I love both of them equally, but I gotta know in the comments, which Dax experience did you enjoy more? Let me know in the comments below. As Helly sees this as her perfect opportunity to distract Milchick so that Mark S can begin the Gemma Miss Casey rescue mission, as she tells him that she'll see him at the equator, which is important for later, as she takes Milchick's means of communication into the bathroom and flushes it down the toilet, and she also manages to trick Seth to following her, and he ends up being locked in the bathroom as well. Now, back to the more seriousness going on with Cole Harbor, we cut to James Egan arriving on a new floor off the elevator to a small room with a console for him to watch Gemma's final test. Meanwhile, we see Drummond arrives on the severed floor and he opens a new mysterious hidden door as we get the return of Lauren, who's got a goat with her for a sacrifice. Now, this is cut between Mark S following the map and we see Gemma entering the Cold Harbor testing room. Now, as she enters, we see her as this new innie, as we know was made by Mark S, and inside we find a baby crib, and wouldn't you know it, it's the same one we saw Audi Mark purchase and ultimately destroy in the flashbacks from episode 7. Now, the Doctor and James are pleased to see that the innie has no recollection of the significance of the crib, and they ask her to dismantle it. Now, the importance behind this, we know from episode 7 that her experiencing the miscarriage was extremely difficult for her and Mark, and their overall relationship was affected as well. So this being such a key and traumatic experience of her Audi's Gemma's life, and again this goes back to the whole purpose of what we saw back in episode 7 with each new innie experiencing a traumatic and terrible pain or trauma. And for her not to recognize it just goes to show that the test and the procedure works and plays into what most of us believe, which is that Lumen wants to mass produce the Severance chip to those who can afford it and use it to not experience any pain or trauma. Now, back in MDR, Milchick manages to get the bathroom door open from Helly. As he's about to walk out, in comes our boy Dylan G with the vending machine to block him in. For me, in a way, this is Dylan's payback from season 1 finale to getting knocked down by Milchick and tackled by him, and we saw to the left him with a cut and a bruise on his head, which we later see happens to Milchick. Now, to answer one of the big mysterious questions we all had, and that is, what's the deal with the goats? As we see, Lauren has Emil the goat here as an offering. Now, we see Drummond questions if it has verve, which can be described as a spirited or energetic approach to life. He follows it by asking if it wiles, which in biblical terms means to trick and deceive, which Lauren responds by saying yes, it does wiles the most of its flock, as her answers are accepted and he lets her in. So the goats have been a big mystery since season 1. Now, goats can symbolize a lot of different things, but as it pertains to the context of this very particular situation, goats are common sacrificial animals throughout history and can be associated with cults, and we know the similarities that Lumen shares to cults. Which leads me to connecting that this particular goat as an offering to being special to the flock and relating it to its importance to Gemma being selected for Cold Harbor, and this goat and Gemma being the perfect match for this particular ritual. Now, the goats may serve more of a purpose that we'll learn about in season 3, but as of right now, it seems that their purpose are mainly being used to sacrifice for means for Lumen to use in events as important as this is. Which leads me to believe that many goats and people doing this exact thing that we're witnessing in this scene has been done in the past, which makes me wonder how often has this occurred. As we watch Drummond prepares the bolt pistol, we see the look of discomfort and hesitation on Lauren's face as she's being tasked to killing it. Now, you notice the drawings across the tomb that the goat gets in. It shows some person bowing on one knee as they give, which I'm assuming is their goat, to this person, probably a cure, as I would imagine as a sacrifice, as it's shown dead in the very next image here. Now, Drummond also says that the animal is for cure in the eternal war against pain, which again adds more credence to the idea that Lumen and people like Drummond and once upon a time Cobell wanted and believed that what they were doing was relieving people from their pain. We can see that she's now fed up with sacrificing these goats that she's grown an attachment to, as we saw back in episode 3 of this season, and the speech that Mark left her department with seemed to have an impact on her in this very moment. Now, during all this, Mark S arrives to the export hall's door, but of course his key card isn't accepted. Now he begins banging against the door and tries to figure out a way inside, but he's making all types of noise that can be heard on the other side of the wall during this goat sacrifice ritual. As Drummond opens the mysterious door and the look on Mark's face says it all, the man is scared out of his mind, and I believe this is the first time that these characters have seen each other in the season, at least from what we've seen. Now, of course, Drummond is very familiar with Mark S, as Mark plays confused and tries to walk away, but remember what Cobell said, once he completed the file, he's not needed anymore from Lumen. As Drummond takes it upon himself to permanently get rid of Mark S, as they have a physical, mostly one-sided fight, as Drummond slams Mark against the wall and punches him and begins tossing him around like Conquest did to another character by the name of Mark in the incredible show Invincible. Now Mark S tries to do his best in this fight by bodying Drummond in his arm, but all it does is makes him angrier as he tosses Mark by his foot and Mark hits his face against the wall. Now all bloodied up, we see Drummond begins choking Mark and becomes like a savage animal himself and is about to kill Mark S, who's on his very last breath, but in comes Lauren and she helps him out as she points the bolt pistol against Drummond's head. Now Drummond quickly knocks the gun out of her hand, and if you know Gwendolyn's past work on a particular show, then like me, you had to get the Brianna Tarth vibes as she goes head up against Drummond. Now he gets his licks in, as does she, but she goes beast mode and gets him down to the ground and begins beating the hell out of him and is about to kill him, but Mark S steps in and stops her because he knows he's his best chance in getting to the export halls into the elevator to the testing room floor. Meanwhile, no offense to the actor, but man, he looks so damn creepy as Jamie Egan and the doctor watch Gemma taking apart the crib and again confirms that the barrier is holding. Now, I don't want to forget to mention that the song playing in the Cold Harbor room is the same song that plays during the scene where Mark is frustrated with building the crib and the same song that Gemma plays in her room before she knocked out the doctor. Again, another sign that she has no memory of the song's significance of her Audi's past. Now, as Mark S takes Drummond to the elevator, he thanks Lauren for her help and she replies by telling him that the goat thanks him for saving it. Now, this being the last time that we see the goat and Lauren, is it possible that she goes back to her department and attempts to free the rest of the goats? Obviously, that's going to probably be impossible to get past the barriers and into the elevator, but besides the point, what I'm getting at is, with her refusing to sacrificing that goat, will it have any impact on her and her department as a whole? Now in the elevator and with the bolt pistol against Drummond's neck, Mark S tells him about what's going to happen next, but unfortunately, the switch happens. As we see, Audi Mark comes to and the trigger gets pulled with the switch when it happened, as we get this Quentin Tarantino blood splattering all over the elevator moment that left me and Mark Audi in complete shock. As the doors to the testing room floor open, we say goodbye to Mr. Drummond in a very bloody and unexpected, satisfying way, but this does leave Mark by himself to finding the Cold Harbor room in this maze of doors. Now, Mark eventually finds the Cold Harbor room, but he's met by Cecily as they have a very funny exchange where Mark points the gun at her and yells at her to open it, but we see that she doesn't open it. Instead, she yells back at him and tells him no and calls him all types of names that aren't too YouTube friendly. Now, Mark realizes that the doors are programmed for those that have access to it as he remembers whose blood is on his tie as he sticks it to the needle reader and it works and the door is open. As he walks inside, Mark sees Gemma for the first time alive in 2 years. Now, this Innie's afraid, of course, and doesn't know who he is, as the doctor and James watch in absolute horror because their little world-changing experiment is about to be ruined. Again, the thing to remember about the season's main theme and its similarities to when someone has lack of sleep that we saw with Irv in season 1, love can override the severance procedure as Gemma reaches out her hand and something inside of her Innie knows that she can trust him as we see them head towards the door. Now, Jamie Egan actually shows he's a human by cursing in frustration as the doctor and Cecily are in panic to stop them. As Gemma steps outside, this is yet another moment that made me get emotional as they can't believe they finally are reunited after all this time to get to this point, a very earned and deserving emotional payoff. It just goes to show the importance of episode 7 of this season, because without that episode and without Gemma's backstory and the love story between her and Mark, this reunion would not have the same emotional impact. As we watch, the alarms are set. As you'll notice, the colors are being used, which is red and blue, and we'll talk about that later, as the doctor chases them as they make their way towards the elevator to make their escape. Back in the MDR department, Milchick continues to find a way out, but Helly takes one of the instruments and hits him in the head and knocking him down and making him even more pissed than he already was. As Milchick yells for the C&M department to return to their area, which they begin to, but this is where Helly does what she does best, as she gives a speech to them about the unpleasant treatment that Lumen has for the innies and how they're treated as expendable. Now, as the alarms are going off at this point, we see that this triggers Milchick, who looks in the mirror and he triggers himself into going into a rage mode as he eventually knocks Dylan from in front of the vending machine that was blocking him. But Milchick is caught by surprise because Helly's speech seemed to work, because now they have the entire C&M department backing them against Mr. Milchick.
No! You'll kill them all!
Now, I'm of two minds about that very line. Now, the doctor may be referring to all the innies at Lumen dying, similar to what Mark was talking about at the cabins, or I'm leaning more towards this idea. I believe he was referring to all the innies being killed inside of Gemma once they leave the testing room floor. Now, he would say that because, as we know, the doctor has feelings for Gemma, and I'm sure all of her outies of that matter, especially the one in Allentown where she played his wife. As Mark and Gemma kiss and are just so happy and excited and together again, and I'm excited and I'm happy they're together again, but as they hit the severed room floor, both Miss Casey and Annie Mark make the switch, and of course this is an awkward moment for the both of them, especially Miss Casey. I don't want to ignore this, and I just want to applaud the brilliance of the acting of all these actors who have to play innies and outies, as we literally see them going from one character having all these emotions in one moment, and as we see here, literally seconds later, they can act like a completely different person. Truly incredible stuff. As we come to an end of this movie-length runtime and overall story of this episode and finale, again, pointing out the alarms going off, we see the red and blue colors being used, representing both the real-world life and also the innies at work, as we see Mark leading Miss Casey and Gemma to the stairwells as planned. Now, Mark convinces Miss Casey to go through, as we see she does, and this is where Gemma returns, and she looks at the other side to see Mark S. as she notices his hesitation and begins begging for him to go through the door. As Mark S. looks at Gemma, a person he just met moments ago for the first time, and Gemma just trying to get her husband to come through the door and follow her so they can make their way out of this hell. Now, I'm not sure if Gemma is fully aware that this is any Mark and not her Mark. I would think that she's aware to some degree that she's talking to an any Mark because of her time on the testing room floor and knowing the difference between an any and an outie, but we don't know if she knows all the details and the intricacies about the differences on being on different floors. Either way, Helly R arrives and calls for Mark, and the look on his face and Gemma's face looking at Helly, I just knew that he was going to pick Helly at this point. As we see, Mark makes up his mind at this metaphorical equator and chooses to run away with Helly in the hallways on the severed room floor with no destination in mind, but it doesn't matter because all they know is they're together again. Love can overcome being severed. As The Windmills of Your Mind by Noel Harrison plays, which is significant to the scene because it's said the meaning behind the lyrics represents a metaphor of often cynical nature in thoughts and memories. The song is also said to be about circles and cycles, both literally and structurally. Circles feature heavily in the lyrics, talking about the windmills, clock faces, apples, balloons, moons, etc. The cycle of seasons, relationships, carousels, as Helly looks back at Gemma, and I can't lie, I had the thought that could this be Helena for a second? But we see as Gemma screaming for Mark, but he doesn't turn back and he leaves with Helly. As we get another cliffhanger, which isn't Helly saying she's pregnant, to end this show, as we watch both Helly and Mark running down the hallway, as we get this classic frame freeze with the image frozen in place as we zoom in to what looked like a classic piece of art and cinema as we fade into red, as it said is directed by the one and only Ben Stiller. That last frame reminded me of something that you'll see in like a Romeo and Juliet story, or one of my personal favorite films of all time, which happens to include Christopher Walken and Patricia Arquette in 1993's True Romance. As two, we see Helly and Mark as two people making their escape from their outie situation. Mark not being with Gemma, and Helly not allowing the Egans to take the one thing that she loves away from her as they attempt their desperate escape to being together, but let's be honest, there will be no honeymoon for these two. Now, for those who follow me on socials have seen what I'm about to say, but for those who don't follow me, which you should, this was my immediate thoughts after watching the finale for the first time Monday evening. Severance Season 2 finale isn't just a satisfying experience, it's a heart-stopping, tear-jerking, emotional masterpiece that left me speechless, breathless, and utterly floored, and you will be too. Now, after watching this episode for the third time in its entirety without having my breakdown in mind and just looking at it from being a fan of the show and not necessarily from a critic's perspective, but I felt this was one of the best final episodes of television I've ever seen. Now, I still have the season 1 finale just a hair above this episode, but that's another conversation for another day. But this finale captured everything I love about this show. It had comedic moments. It had great character payoff moments. It answered important questions from season 1 and season 2, but more importantly, it earned my emotions for my care with these characters. Now, I plan to have more thoughts on being shared in future videos, but I'll say this. I thought this second season wasn't as tight or concise as season 1, and I believe the behind-the-scenes change of showrunners and the writer strike played a part in that, but I still felt that this was an incredible season for one of the best shows on TV. There are some issues that I had with the season overall and the finale. For example, the unsatisfying conclusion to the reintegration process in Ragabi and that not having a payoff. Of course, Irving and Bert conclusion, Rickon writing a book for Lumen, and there's other things that we'll discuss in the coming weeks. Now, I want to end by saying this. First and foremost, if you're still here at this point, this is a very long video. I'm very aware of that. But I want you all to put in the comments right now, #ColdHarbor. And I want to take this time to thank everyone who's watched, liked, shared, subscribed from my season's coverage of Severance Season 2. Now look, I've been doing this YouTube and creating content on a consistent basis since 2017, and while I've experienced so much joy from covering some of my favorite movies and shows during that time, my season 2 coverage of this show has been one of the most stressful experiences because of the amount of time that I put towards these breakdowns and my theory videos. But at the same time, it's been the most gratifying experience I've had covering any piece of media on this channel. I know there are tons of bigger channels, mid-sized channels, and everything in between across the internet that covers this incredible show. But the fact that some of you all have watched all my videos, or a couple of my videos, and had good things to say, bad things to say, I mispronounced this, I missed this fact, and everything that goes down with covering a show like this, I just want to say I'm forever thankful and grateful for the support you all have shown me over the past 10 weeks. Again, I'll have to sit down and come up with some good ideas, but I plan on making more Severance content as we patiently await the season 3, wherever that's going to come. But in the meantime, thank you all for watching. Remember, you all are awesome. Stay safe, and we'll end this video with this.
I love you.